It started with a feeling that something was off long before anyone could explain why. There was no single moment that triggered alarm. No loud event. No obvious mistake. Just a growing sense that the situation did not align with how it should have unfolded. People involved would later describe it the same way, using similar words, even though they spoke separately and years apart. Something about this case was never right. At first, nothing appeared unusual. The setting was ordinary. The people were ordinary. The circumstances seemed routine enough to avoid scrutiny. That is what makes this case so difficult to understand. There was no clear point where things went wrong. Instead, there was a slow drift away from normality, subtle enough that no one reacted until it was far too late. The case took place in a quiet region where life followed predictable patterns. Days blended together. People recognized each other. Changes were noticed quickly because there were so few of them. It was the kind of place where routines mattered, where absence was noticed, and where silence carried weight. The individuals at the center of the story were not strangers to this environment. They were part of it. Their lives were documented through ordinary records, conversations, and habits. They had plans. They had responsibilities. There was nothing in their past behavior that suggested they would become the focus of a mystery that still resists explanation. In the period leading up to the incident, everything appeared normal. Communication was consistent. Behavior was predictable. There were no reports of conflict, fear, or distress. If there were internal struggles, they were not visible to anyone else. On the surface, life continued without disruption. Then came the first irregularity. It was small, easy to dismiss. A minor deviation from an expected routine. Something that, under any other circumstances, would not have warranted concern. But later, it would be identified as the moment when the case quietly began to unravel. Attempts to clarify the situation were initially casual. Messages were sent. Time passed. Assumptions were made. People trusted that there was a simple explanation waiting to be uncovered. There always is, until there isn't. As hours turned into a day, concern replaced patience. The absence became noticeable. The silence became heavier. When efforts to restore contact failed, people decided to look for answers in person. What they encountered did not make sense. There were signs of interruption, but not chaos. Evidence of movement, but not urgency. Objects were present, yet their placement suggested that something had caused a sudden change in behavior. Not fear in the traditional sense. Not violence. Something quieter, more confusing. The most unsettling detail was not what was found, but what was missing. There were no clear indications of an accident. No obvious signs of outside interference. No immediate reason for the situation to have escalated the way it did. The absence of explanation was itself alarming. As the timeline was examined, contradictions emerged almost immediately. Accounts differed on key details. Times did not align. Actions seemed out of order. Simple decisions appeared unnecessarily complicated. Logical steps were skipped entirely. People involved described moments of hesitation, followed by actions they could not later explain. Choices that felt wrong even as they were being made. Decisions that did not reflect their usual behavior. The main event unfolded within a narrow window of time. A short span during which several critical decisions occurred. When reconstructed, this period became the focal point of the investigation. Every second mattered. Every movement was analyzed. And yet, no matter how carefully it was examined, the sequence refused to make sense. Some actions suggested awareness. Others suggested confusion. There were moments that implied caution, followed by choices that seemed reckless. The inconsistency was striking. It was as if normal reasoning had fractured, leaving behind fragments that did not fit together. When authorities became involved, the hope was that expertise would bring clarity. Instead, the confusion deepened. Initial conclusions leaned toward familiar explanations. Human error, miscommunication, stress. These explanations were comforting because they were understandable. But as evidence was reviewed, each explanation encountered problems. Certain details could not be reconciled with these assumptions. Some actions did not align with known behavior patterns. Some outcomes did not match the supposed causes. The story began to feel incomplete. Mistakes were made early in the investigation. Certain possibilities were dismissed too quickly. Others were given too much weight. The focus shifted more than once, creating gaps in understanding that were never fully closed. As time passed, pressure grew to provide answers. The longer the case remained unresolved, the more uncomfortable it became. Uncertainty invites speculation, and speculation filled the silence where facts failed. New information surfaced sporadically, but instead of clarifying the situation, it added complexity. Each new detail raised fresh questions. Each attempt at explanation exposed another inconsistency. People who reviewed the case years later noticed the same pattern. The deeper they looked, the less cohesive the story became. It was not that information was missing. It was that the information did not align. Several theories emerged over time. One explanation suggested a series of small, unrelated factors that combined in an unfortunate way. A chain reaction of ordinary events leading to an extraordinary outcome. This theory accounted for some details, but required an unlikely level of coincidence. Another theory proposed external influence. Not necessarily something dramatic or malicious, but a factor outside the awareness of those involved. Something subtle enough to go unnoticed, yet powerful enough to alter behavior. This idea explained certain inconsistencies but lacked concrete evidence. Psychological explanations were also considered. Acute stress can distort perception. Fiar canoveri de logic. In extreme situations, people do not always act rationally. These explanations made sense in theory, but they did not fully match the circumstances of the case. Environmental factors were examined as well. Conditions that could affect judgment without leaving obvious traces. Situations where perception and reality diverged just enough to cause irreversible mistakes. These possibilities remained difficult to prove. No single theory explained everything. Each one addressed part of the puzzle while ignoring another. Each one required assumptions that could not be verified. And each one left behind unanswered questions. What continued to trouble those who studied the case was not just the lack of answers, but the feeling that something fundamental was missing. A key element that, if identified, could bring the entire story into focus. Without it, the narrative remained fractured. As years passed, the case faded from public attention, only to resurface again when someone new examined it with fresh eyes. Each revival brought renewed interest, followed by the same conclusion. The facts were real. The events were documented. But the meaning remained elusive. People who had been close to the case described a lasting sense of unease. Not fear, but discomfort. The kind that lingers because it cannot be resolved. The kind that resists closure. What makes this case so unsettling is how ordinary it began. There was no warning. No dramatic turning point. Just a quiet deviation from normality that spiraled into something inexplicable. Some believe the truth is simple, obscured only by human error. Others believe it is complex, involving factors we do not fully understand. And some believe the case remains unresolved because it challenges assumptions we rely on to feel safe. That logic always applies. That behavior follows patterns. That every story has an explanation. This one does not. The evidence exists. The timeline can be reconstructed. The people were real. And yet, the story refuses to settle into a single interpretation. Something about this case was never right. Was it a coincidence pushed too far? A misunderstanding that escalated beyond control? Or an influence that went unnoticed because no one thought to look for it? If the explanation exists, why does it remain hidden? And if it does not, what does that say about our ability to understand the events around us? Some questions fade with time. Others become heavier. And this case, even now, remains one of those that never quite lets go.